Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're joined by Andrew Gorecki. Andrew, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here, Chris.
Yeah, we're really excited to chat with you. For folks that don't know you, maybe haven't read your book or any talks or other content you've put out, can you tell us a bit about your background professionally?
Of course. So I've been in the cybersecurity industry for about a decade in various roles. I started out as an engineer in Europe, but over the last several years, I've been really focusing on cyber breach response, breach remediation. I got into cyber resiliency over the last couple of years, and now my primary focus is on cloud security. So 3 years ago, I published a book on cyber breach response that essentially kind of encapsulates all the lessons learned from working with clients who experienced significant breaches, whether it was data theft or ransomware. And currently, I'm working on a book on how to manage cyber crisis.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny. So I typically close with this question because, our show is about cyber resiliency, but I feel like based on the conversations you and I have had and sort of what we're going to talk about today, I think it's pertinent to start with this. So what does cyber resiliency mean to you, especially given, the book that you've written, the expertise that you have around cloud security? How would you define it and what does it mean to you?
Well, so first of all, I would like to compare cyber resilience to zero trust. In a sense that I think it's a misunderstood and arbitrarily used term in the industry. And I noticed that often cyber resiliency is used in the context of recovery, but it's actually much bigger than that. Like there are various definitions, but for me, cyber resiliency really is about being able to anticipate threats. Essentially, how do you protect your organization against threats? How you withstand attacks. In other words, how do you continue business operations and deliver critical services while being attacked, whether it's DDoS, ransomware, or some type of attack. If an attack negatively impacts the availability of your systems, how do you actually recover in the shortest time possible to minimize that impact? But also how you leverage threat intelligence and essentially knowledge about adversaries to optimize and continually improve your cybersecurity. And you may think, well, hang on, that sounds just like cybersecurity. It's essentially, he's just covered the 4 phases of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So maybe I'll explain. For me, cyber resiliency is a goal of cybersecurity. Like another goal might be data privacy, compliance, and so on. For me, cyber resilience is about designing systems in a way that helps you withstand cyber attacks and operate and continue business operations under adverse conditions. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And I like to focus on critical services. For example, if you're a hospital and you are not cyber resilient against attacks, likely you won't be able to deliver patient care. But also it's not about, like just the health sector, it's not about banking, but it's also about the small organizations, maybe even the retail sector and other sectors that we would consider non-critical. And I think COVID proved it when we essentially had issues with, supply chain and people were queuing for basics. So in a nutshell, cyber resilience is about keeping those critical systems running so we can get on with our daily lives.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that, especially because it's really not sector specific. It's everything from small businesses to large businesses, yes. Healthcare, supply chain, everything in between. Yes. So why do you think, this concept has been around for a while, whether we're calling it cyber resiliency or zero trust or whatever we're talking about or whatever we're calling it, but it's been around for a long time. But why do you think, especially in the last couple of years, we've been hearing more about cyber resiliency? We've been hearing more about organizations who are thinking about this, especially as they're maturing their cybersecurity programs and thinking about that as more of a mature, sort of building a secure program. So why do you think this is getting a lot more attention in the last couple of years?
So I think there are 2 reasons. One is essentially the acceleration of digitization across all organizations. In fact, every organization, every major organization is digital these days. If you look at any business process, whether it's in the healthcare supplying essentially healthcare to patients or whether it's selling widgets, every aspect of a business process is underpinned by technology. So an availability impact on that technology will essentially have impact on the services the organizations can provide. In other words, we live in a digital world. Also, I think COVID highlighted some of our dependencies on technology, especially with remote working. But also, I think some of the most prolific attacks, like the colonial pipeline, some of the other prolific attack, and the proliferation or rise of cybercrime really accelerated that kind of the discussions around cyber resiliency and being able to withstand those attacks and maybe even protect ourselves in the first place. I think what we've seen over the last 2-3 years, or maybe in 5 years, is that cyber threats are actually even more likely to happen than natural disasters. If you look at, for example, some of the World Economic Forum papers, when they rank global threats, cybersecurity is one of the top 5, sometimes even 3 threats. So I think that's why the topic of cyber resiliency seems to be very popular right now. And what I noticed, Nikki and Chris, is that it's not even the topic is not only popular among technologists, it's also popular around business leaders who are essentially wants to keep their businesses running.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with the increased digitalization, and then obviously COVID, kind of brought a lot of our fragile, brittle supply chain problems to light. So I wanted to ask you too. I know in previous roles you've focused a lot on like breach response and recovery and things like that for essentially large, complex, advanced organizations in many cases. Looking back on some of the roles you've held, what were some of the most like common attack vectors or vulnerabilities that kind of came back to bite organizations that they necessarily weren't prepared for?
So I'm not going to give you the most possibly interesting or esoteric access. What we see is just the same vulnerabilities, users being phished, a lack of network segmentation, poor identity and access control mechanisms, and so on. And it's, to be honest, like a lot of organizations still struggle with it. I sometimes, kind of joke that ransomware is a way of paying your technical debt. Because essentially the type of attacks and organizations we responded to had a large amount of technical debt and very basic vulnerabilities that that could have been addressed years ago. And also, what is worth noting about some of even the most prolific attacks that we've heard on the media in recent years is that they've not been that sophisticated, to be honest. And a lot of those attacks were really opportunistic in nature, meaning that the threat actors essentially operate in a complex cybercrime ecosystem, and they want to make money the same way commercial businesses want to make money. So they will always go for the low-hanging fruit, and if they cannot, if they knock on the door, the door's not open, they go somewhere else. So sadly, the organizations that have the most severe impact from threats like ransomware, those organizations that have a lot of technical debt. But also what is sad about it, that those organizations typically take the longer to recover. In my experience, even up to 6 weeks just to recover operations. And I'm not talking about stabilizing the operations and making sure that systems perform according to the SLAs. So I would say there's nothing like kind of sexy or esoteric about new techniques. It's really exploiting vulnerabilities, phishing users, taking advantage of poor network segmentation. But I would say at the heart of most of those attacks is really identity compromise, escalating privileges, getting access to your domain controllers, and essentially leveraging those kind of keys to the kingdom to deploy ransomware, exfiltrate data, or perform some other malicious activities.
Yeah, your answer is actually exactly what I was hoping for. For all the headlines we see about, quantum resistant encryption, it's really just typical, a basic cyber hygiene that's really getting most organizations in trouble. So I wanted to ask, and I love your analogy about ransomware as being a tax essentially for not modernizing their infrastructure and operations. So I wanted to ask you on the flip side of that, what are some, having seen a lot of these incidents and impacts for organizations, what are some key or critical controls, if you had to name, just a few things that organizations can do to get like the best bang for their buck or biggest impact of mitigating some of the risk?
Yeah, so maybe I'll approach this question from two perspectives, like kind of like tooling and what you can do from a security perspective, but also maybe first I will focus on the fundamentals. And before we even focus on security tooling, threat monitoring, and so on, just focus on your identity and access management first of all. Every major attack that I responded to included essentially the compromise of identity. And then even if a threat actor or adversary compromises low privileged identity, then they find a way to kind of escalate the privileges all the way to domain admin. So focus on fundamental identity and access management hygiene. Network segmentation is big, but I consider personally network segmentation as a secondary control, because once you've got access to highly privileged accounts, it's easier to move largely. And also, I think network segmentation is one of those things that is very difficult to address, because essentially you have to redesign your data center if you're on premises. In cloud, it's a bit different. But if you cannot do traditional network segmentation, at least think about micro segmentation of your critical workloads. Of course, vulnerability management, at least for the internet facing systems, if you don't know what your vulnerabilities are and you cannot patch them, you expose yourself. But then what I would say, Chris and Nikki, is that for me, asset management really underpins all those things, because I responded to critical incidents when client would have a state-of-the-art tools, but those tools wouldn't be deployed on all systems because the client didn't know what systems they had in the first place. So you cannot really monitor and deploy and then monitor compliance with like specific policies if you don't know actually what you have. So again, it's not the most esoteric access. It's really about the fundamental security hygienes, because as I said, a lot of the attacks are not sophisticated. They just take advantage of like the traditional, what I would call traditional weaknesses. So that's the first part. When it comes to tooling, what I would say is, I know that I work for a vendor, but focus on essentially modern endpoint detection tools. Network security is very important, but I would say focus on EDR with next generation AV, because and make sure that you've got the right logs both for detection and response. And essentially monitor for those, because I responded a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, to like a major ransomware event when the client in fact had all the logs, and when the client antivirus was lighting like a Christmas tree, just nobody was monitoring it. So essentially, again, focus on the fundamental known in the industry. I'm not encouraging you to think about quantum computing, AI, and so on. These are very these terms are used very frequently right now, but actually what gives you the most value for your money is just focusing on the fundamentals. And of course, everyone talks about zero trust. I think zero trust is a very broad term, but if implemented correctly, especially at the identity level, it really impedes an attacker's ability to operate in your environment, meaning that it increases your window to detect and remediate an attack before there's an impact. Because from an attack chain perspective, it's not a big bang approach. Someone really has to get in access to your network, escalate privileges, move largely, do more reconnaissance, escalate privileges more, and every step, every technique that a threat actor executes in your environment gives you an opportunity to detect and remediate. So focus on the fundamentals, monitor, and respond. Again, I'm not recommending AI, quantum computing on some of the latest and greatest terms we hear. Focus on the fundamentals. And the good news is that doesn't cost a lot of money, but on the other hand, it requires everyone to work together, especially in IT and cybersecurity. That might be a challenge for many modern enterprises.
Yeah, I think very well said, right? It's one of the reasons why I think vulnerability management is so interesting, because if you can take care of some of that low-hanging fruit, some of those easier to sort of handle vulnerabilities that have been hanging out for a while, they may help, prevent a number of different types of attacks from occurring.
Yes.
So when we talk about cyber resiliency, and I feel like we've talked about it in a lot of different ways, even over the years that we've been doing this podcast, but I think when we talk about cyber resiliency and how do you understand resiliency, I think we talk about it, a lot of times we talk about it from a security architecture standpoint. Sometimes we talk about it at the management or strategy layer, but I'm curious if you feel like there's other areas within other domains within security, other groups of people within security that might be able to benefit from cyber resiliency and what it could mean to their own security tooling or their own teams. Do you feel like we, could maybe stretch this out and talk to some new people about cyber resiliency?
Yeah, one of the things that I like about cyber resiliency is that it's a topic that can kind of, I call it, spans the entire stack vertically, but it also, it's kind of horizontally. With zero trust, you can talk about zero trust strategy to an executive, but also you can talk about it to security engineer, about like how to implement it. But I'm just but also it touches on people, it touches on process. Like, for example, I think like taking a different turn, Nikki, like if you look at COVID, like, and what happened during COVID, I think you could think about cyber resiliency in terms of people resiliency. You know, you may run your critical workloads, but if you half of your engineers quits or half of your workforce is sick, you may not have enough resources to support those systems that essentially run critical workloads that run your business processes. Also, like from a cyber resiliency, like when I try to visualize it, cyber resiliency is not a domain in itself. It's really kind of connected to crisis management. It's connected to technology resiliency. It's connecting to enterprise risk management, because effectively you cannot implement cyber resiliency without enterprise risk management. It's connected to people resiliency. That's why I think it's kind of an overarching concept that brings all those domains together, because unless we bring those domains together and kind of they operate in the concert, you cannot achieve cyber resiliency. But also, Nikki, what I noticed is kind of going back to the technical aspect is that cyber resiliency is often discussed, you know, for kind of traditional on-premises systems or systems that support kind of traditional, you know, traditional technology that supports business processes, but I don't hear a lot about cyber resiliency in the cloud, and especially I don't hear a lot about cyber resiliency when it comes to software supply chain and SaaS. And it's again a very interesting topic, because we shift from owning systems, controlling those systems, to actually you know, trusting third parties. Like in the traditional cloud world, we talked about it, you know, shared responsibility model. But for me, actually, it's a trust model, because you not only outsource, you know, certain systems to third parties, but actually trust that they manage those systems securely, and an availability impact at their end will not have a major availability impact on your system to, again, deliver critical services to the communities and your customers. So I think it's one of those topics that you can discuss from different angles. But what is very important is that you just integrate those different domains. So you just so you take a holistic view of the various components that really help your enterprise to become cyber resilient.
Yeah, well, and you took it back to humans, and I want to talk a little bit about human factors too, because I think you touched on something really important, which is that, you know, cyber breach response, cyber resiliency, it's not just about the tools that we have and how do we make sure that they're highly available, but how do we make sure that the people managing those tools are, you know, not getting burnt out, are not missing those alerts, you know, from AV or EDR detection. So what do you think would be maybe some tips or tricks for improving that sort of human resilience, that human factor, when it comes to cyber resiliency or cyber breach response?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Nikki, and I'm not sure that I have the perfect answer for you. And the reason I don't have a perfect answer, I think it's because it depends on your business model, the size of your organization, where you operate, and whether, you know, you're leaning more towards outsourcing your cybersecurity capabilities versus, you know, having technical personnel in-house. But what I would prescribe is that no matter of what your business and technology strategy is, actually have a plan. Okay, so if, let's say, ask yourself, if half of your workforce was to suddenly leave the organization, and it happens because cybersecurity is a very hot market, it happens. What would you do? How would you mitigate the impact? Would you temporarily partner with an outsourcing organization? Or would you try to upskill? Think about, you know, having maybe 2 people cross training, so you don't rely on those single points of failures. You know, Nikki, one of the things that we talked about, I think in the past, it was the Phoenix project, and I forgot the name of the engineer in the Phoenix project who was essentially running the entire organization. So make sure you don't end up in that situation when you have one person who's got a lot of tribal knowledge of the entire organizations, how the systems are architected or how the security tool work, and that person one day becomes sick, and, you know, and you cannot rely on others. So make sure you cross-train your workforce, make sure there's no single points of failures. But also what I would say, and again, maybe I'm a bit biased, but partner with trusted vendors. Especially if you're a small organization, you may not have necessarily all the resources to employ the best security talent, cybersecurity talent, or retain that talent. So partner with cybersecurity vendors, but I would say intelligently leverage them. As a vendor, I've been in situations when a client came to us and say, hey, can you just do it for us? Whereas vendors may have like amazing skills and the tooling, but they don't understand the organization. They don't understand the architecture. They don't understand the business context, the culture. So they can, in many cases, they can augment your capabilities, but they cannot replace your capabilities. It's not kind of like lift and shift from on-prem to cloud, where you just spin a server in a cloud and off you go. So I would say that when it comes to humans and human resiliency, you have to plan. It's not something that you can, even if you want to outsource, you cannot outsource the business context. You cannot outsource the tribal knowledge. So you have to work with your vendors. You have to prevent single points of failures and have a game plan for when, let's say half of your workforce is suddenly not available, whether it's COVID or maybe, they leave for another organization or something happens. You have to be ready, have a plan.
I wanted to ask you another question. I know we're going to dive into your book a little bit here with Nikki in a moment, but your book is titled Cyber Breach Response That Actually Works, Organizational Approaches to Managing Residual Risk. And
Yes.
the reason I wanted to bring that up from my perspective is the residual risk piece. For one, can you define residual risk for people who aren't familiar with it? And then two,
Yes.
Any recommendations on like how organizations, go about understanding the risk that they have entirely, and then understanding like what they've mitigated and what remains, getting to that residual risk point basically.
Yeah, so that was a key term when I was actually thinking about the title, because like the last several years I really spent in consulting, not necessarily hands-on roles, and I was explaining and I was talking about a kind of a proactive approach to cybersecurity and preventing breaches. And I would explain and I was trying to find a way for clients to explain why they need incident response capabilities and why they need to, partner with cyber breach response vendors. And I realized that, you cannot completely mitigate your risk. No matter what resources you have, there are always smart people that will find a way to compromise your organization. And there's always that residual risk. And you cannot just keep throwing resources until the risk disappears, because you will be spending more money on mitigating risk than actually, than your revenue. So I came up with the idea that, well, maybe it's not my idea, but I kind of put it in the context of breach response, that incident response and breach response, and these are two related but slightly two different domains. It's all about mitigating the residual risk when other security control fail. And what I meant by mitigating residual risk is, earlier on I explained the attack chain, like initial compromise, privilege escalation, and so on. And I sometimes say to clients, Chris, that having an security incident is not a bad thing, because first a threat actor has to get into your network, then they have to escalate privileges, do a bit of reconnaissance, and so on. It's kind of like a cycle. So if you shift left and detect the incident in the early phases of the of the life cycle, then you just remediate the asset, not a big deal. But if an attacker has the ability to do reconnaissance and progress through the chain, start exfiltrating data, the further the attacker progresses the attack chain, the higher the cost of remediation, and potentially the remediation becomes disruptive. So residual risk is really about shifting left. Managing residual risk is about shifting left and detecting an incident in the early phases of the attack lifecycle before it progresses to full-blown breach with data theft impact or even ransomware impact. So that's how I approached it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I did want to dive deeper into your book too, because I have your copy right here. I love it because, especially someone who's done incident response in the past, I think, you made that distinction between what is breach response and incident response. But one of the things that, as an incident responder, depending on what type of incident you're dealing with, it's really helpful to have some sort of resource to, how do I build an incident response program? Because I think a lot of organizations are still sort of in that process, right? Like, how do we build a comprehensive incident response plan? So, so can you talk a little bit first about why you wrote the book, what you were hoping to get out of it, and then, how you're hoping it might help organizations or other people in the industry?
Yeah. So the reason why I wrote this book was, well, actually I got into the industry about 6-7 years ago. And what I realized that it's just a lot of tribal knowledge. And if the tribal knowledge get passed along, then it's great. But if you're new to this industry, or maybe you come from an IT background or kind of non-traditional technology background to build a cybersecurity program, you may struggle. So what I wanted to do is not just focus on best practices by NIST and so on, but just really take lessons learned of my observations, experience from the trenches of response, and create a guide that would help organizations build capabilities that actually they need instead they think they need. Because sometimes if you look at compliance standards and some kind of the more theoretical academic resources, they take a very academic approach, and sometimes that approach might be confusing to practitioners. Whereas I took the other approach. I acquired the tribal knowledge, and I was lucky to work with very remarkable people who came from organizations like Mandiant at that time, and I could really learn from them and pick up and the knowledge, skills, experience, and then lead engagements into those breaches myself. So, and I had a lot of observations, and I was taking notes, and as we spoke in the past, like my head was buzzing with ideas, and I was like, okay, how do I take that chaos from my head and organize it and cluster the ideas around kind of common themes and create a resource that would help organizations to actually build program from the scratch all the way up to having a fully functional program. So how do you even determine whether you need an incident response program? How you strategize about it? How do you gain resources and sell the idea to your business executives before even thinking about buying any security tools? Then when you've got a business buying, how do you actually strategize what type of capabilities you need, whether it's people, technology, what process you have to develop? How do you acquire talent? How do you make decisions regarding, like what I'm going to build in-house versus what I need to retain, and how do I make a partnership with a vendor successful? And even, some of the last chapter, so maybe before jumping to the last chapter, then I also focused about how do you build a cybersecurity plan, incident response plan that actually work for your organization, then how you handle those major incidents. But I think one of the last chapter was the most interesting one, and in non-traditional, because in the last 2-3 years, it's been all about also managing legal risks. So so essentially, what are the legal considerations and data privacy considerations that you have to take into account when building your team? For example, how do you work with data privacy attorneys, with lawyers? How do you collect and preserve evidence that they are defensible and in court? For example, how GDPR influences the way you transfer data, forensic data between countries if you are a global organization. So again, I didn't focus necessarily on like the tools, techniques, like the sort of nerdy things, because there were already resources. I want to take kind of a more organizational approach. And Chris, going back to your previous questions, that's why it's called the subtitles organizational approach to managing risk, because I didn't want the book to be about forensic techniques.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Well, I had just one more question for you before we take us out, because I know you mentioned at the beginning you're working on another book.
Yes.
I know you have some other cool things that you might be working on. So can you talk just a little bit about what you're working on now, when maybe we can expect the book, and give us like a little teaser?
Yeah, of course. So currently I'm working on a book on managing cyber crisis. So it's based on a SONA framework created by my colleague and friend Chris Scott, who is also the co-author of the book. So we partnered with CISO DRG. I think some of you may know CISO DRG. And essentially we wanted to create, again, another resource that is based on our experience in the trenches of managing not just incident, but also crisis, because many of those breaches that we responded to, from a tactical perspective, yeah, there was, the forensics, recovery, and, the traditional activities. But at the top, if you think like kind of a layer response, like a cake, you had a crisis response with the executives involved, legal, public relations, internal communications, BCP, and so on. And the question was like, okay, many organizations knew how to handle traditional disasters like, maybe flooding, hurricanes, and so on, but they were confused how to handle cyber events, especially when a cyber event doesn't lead to operational impact like ransomware, but it leads to a severe reputational impact, associated with data theft, PII exfiltration, and so on. So Chris created a framework called SONA over the years, which stands for stabilize the situation, organize the response, negotiate key actions with stakeholders, articulate those key actions, and manage public and internal communications, and then recover and remediate. So it's kind of a circular framework, an iterative framework that you go through as you respond to a cyber crisis. So what we are trying to do is explain to the audience, what a cyber crisis is, what are some of the key considerations when you respond to the crisis, how how you bring everyone together, and how do you respond as an organization, but more from a strategic perspective, not necessarily from a tactical perspective. So we are hoping that we are both very busy. So we are hoping that, maybe later this year, the book will be released. A lot of the material has been written, but we just have to go through a couple of rounds of reviews. But I'm hoping that around June or maybe early Q3, the book will be out.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to seeing your new book come out. I wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us this morning, talking about all things cyber breach response, incident response, human factors. I mean, we touched on a lot of things. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us. And that'll take us out for this week. And we'll see everybody next Friday. Thanks, Andrew.